I'm 68 years old, and for too many of those years, Walter called me his punching bag. The wife he could terrorize when the whiskey took hold. He never suspected that behind my fearful eyes I was carefully documenting every threat, every smashed plate, every tear he caused. He didn't know about my hidden diary or the neighbor who heard it all through our paper-thin walls. Before I begin, I need to say thank you for listening to me pour my heart out. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is. I love hearing from you. And if you haven't already, please hit that subscribe button. It helps me more than you know. The man I married 42 years ago was a charmer. Quick with a laugh, light on his feet, with a smile that could coax the birds from the trees. We built a life together. Him as a skilled machinist, me as a part-time library assistant in our small house on Elm Street. We weren't rich, but we had enough. We had each other. We had dreams. But dreams, I've learned, can curdle like milk left in the sun. Love, even a love you thought was bedrock, can erode, washed away by the relentless tide of bitter spirits. Walter always enjoyed a drink. A beer after work, a whiskey on Saturday night. It was social, convivial. I never saw the harm. Not then. But slowly, insidiously, over the last decade, and with terrifying acceleration since his retirement 5 years ago, that enjoyment morphed into desperate daily need. The man I loved vanished bit by bit, replaced by a stranger who wore his face but carried his father's temper. A temper I'd only seen glimpses of in our early years, now magnified and distorted by the constant haze of alcohol. Now my life is a tightrope walk. A constant nerve-shredding dance around Walter's moods, dictated entirely by the level of alcohol in his bloodstream. Our small home, once filled with the scent of my baking and the murmur of contented conversation, now perpetually reeks of stale beer and cheap whiskey. When he's drunk, which is most of the time now, Walter is a storm waiting to break. His words, once kind, are now slurred vicious barbs aimed to wound. I am useless. Stupid. A nagging old crone. He blames me for everything. For his lost job, though he was fired for drinking. For the friends who no longer visit, driven away by his belligerence. For the meager state of our finances, our pension mostly siphoned off to feed his habit. If it weren't for you, he'll slur, his eyes bloodshot and unfocused, I'd have been somebody. You dragged me down, woman. The verbal assaults are a daily rain. Sometimes a drizzle of contempt, sometimes a hailstorm of rage. But it's the physical intimidation that truly hollows me out, leaving me a trembling wreck. He hasn't used his fists on my face. Not yet. But his presence is a constant threat. He looms over me, his large frame reeking of alcohol, his voice a low growl if I don't move fast enough to fetch his drink or find his misplaced wallet. Objects become missiles in his drunken furies. A plate shattered against the wall near my head because dinner was cold. A book hurled across the room because the television annoyed him. He'll back me into corners, his face contorted, his fists clenching and unclenching. His voice thundering about some perceived slight, some imagined disobedience. I've learned to make myself small. To stay silent. To anticipate his needs before he even voices them. Anything to avoid triggering that terrifying switch. Our home has become my prison. The thin walls of our little house offer no escape from his presence. Mrs. Peterson next door, a kind widow like myself, sometimes gives me a worried look over the fence when I'm tending my small patch of marigolds. The only place I feel a sliver of peace. I wonder what she hears through those walls. Does she hear his shouting? Does she hear things breaking? Does she hear my silence? Drop a heart in the comments if you know what it's like to feel trapped in your own home. Write strength if you think women like me deserve better. I'm too ashamed to speak of it. Too indoctrinated by years of what happens in a marriage stays in a marriage. His pension, our only reliable income now, mostly disappears down his throat or into the till at Molly's, the dingy bar at the end of our street. I stretch what little remains, performing weekly miracles to keep food on the table and the lights on. My own small savings, squirreled away from birthdays and Christmases past, are nearly gone. Used to cover the bills he forgets or the damages he causes. He calls me stingy if I question his need for money, then berates me for the bareness of our cupboards. I often lie awake at night, listening to his drunken snores from the sofa where he usually passes out. And I remember the Walter who wooed me with poetry and off-key serenades. Where did that man go? Was he ever truly there? Or was he just a facade, easily dissolved by alcohol? The love I felt for him has long since been corroded by fear and resentment, leaving behind only a weary sense of duty and a desperate, unspoken prayer for it all to just stop. But it doesn't stop. It escalates. Last week, he was convinced I'd hidden his favorite whiskey bottle. A bottle he'd finished the night before. He tore the kitchen apart, yanking open cupboards, throwing tins on the floor, his face purple with rage, screaming that I was trying to control him, to dry him out like some damn preacher. He backed me against the counter, his fist raised, his eyes like burning coals. For a heart-stopping moment, I thought he would strike me. He didn't. Not then. He just brought his fist down on the countertop with a crash that rattled every dish in the house, then stumbled out, slamming the door so hard a picture of our wedding day fell from the wall. The glass shattered. I swept up the broken glass, my hands shaking so violently I could barely hold the dustpan. That incident, the sheer unrestrained menace in his eyes, had been a new level of terror. The fear is no longer vague unease. It's a constant cold companion. He's getting worse, and a dreadful certainty is growing within me. If I don't do something, the next time he raises his fist, he might not stop it. The thought of what the next time might bring keeps me a prisoner as much as any locked door. The late autumn air had turned bitingly cold, much like the atmosphere that had permanently settled in my marriage. I'd spent the afternoon meticulously darning one of his old work shirts. A futile act of care for a man who no longer seemed to notice or appreciate anything beyond the bottom of a bottle. I was just putting away my sewing basket when the front door crashed open with violence that made my heart leap into my throat. Walter. And he was in one of his blackest moods. He stumbled in, reeking of cheap whiskey and stale cigarette smoke, his face a thundercloud. I knew that look. It meant he'd lost money gambling. Money we didn't have. Or he'd gotten into another pointless argument at Molly's, the dismal bar that had become his second home. And as always, I would be the one to bear the brunt of his towering rage. "Woman," he bellowed, his voice a gravelly roar that seemed to shake the small house. "Where's my dinner?" A man works his fingers to the bone, a blatant lie. He hadn't worked a proper day in years, and he can't even get a hot meal in his own damn house. I'd learned long ago that reasoning with him in this state was like trying to reason with a hurricane. "It's on the stove, Walter," I said, my voice carefully neutral, keeping my eyes downcast. "I kept it warm for you." "Warm?" He spat the word. He lurched toward the kitchen, and I heard the clatter of a pot lid hitting the floor, followed by a string of vile curses. "This slop is cold. Cold as your heart, you miserable old trout." I flinched but remained silent, my hands gripping the arms of my chair. This was the overture. The familiar ugly prelude to his nightly performance of cruelty. He reappeared in the doorway, swaying slightly, a half-eaten bread roll clutched in one hand, his eyes narrowed to slits. "You think you're so high and mighty, don't you?" he slurred, advancing on me. Sitting there all quiet, judging me. "Well, I've had enough of your damn judgments." He was looming over me now, his alcohol-sour breath washing over my face. I shrank back into my chair, trying to make myself as small as possible. "Walter, please," I whispered. "You're drunk. Let's not argue." "Argue?" He laughed, a harsh barking sound. "Oh, we're not going to argue, Rose. I'm just going to tell you a few home truths." He leaned closer, his face contorted. "You know what you are to me? After 40 years of your nagging and your complaining and your uselessness." His voice dropped to a menacing growl, and my blood ran cold. I could see the veins throbbing in his temples, the wild, unfocused rage in his eyes. This was different. This was worse than usual. The air crackled with terrifying, unstable energy. "You want to know what you really are, Rose," he repeated, his spit hitting my cheek. He drew himself up, and for a horrifying second, I thought he was going to strike me right there. A full-blown physical assault. Instead, he balled his fist and slammed it into the wall just inches from my head. The drywall cracked with a sickening thud. A small framed picture of our grandchildren skittered to the floor. I cried out, cowering. "You're good for one thing, old woman," he bellowed, his face a mask of pure venom, his eyes blazing into mine. "You're nothing but my worthless old punching bag. That's all you've ever been. Here to absorb whatever crap life or I decide to throw at you. A place to dump my anger so I don't take it out on someone who matters." His words, each one a poison dart, found their mark. Worthless. Punching bag. Dehumanized. Erased. The sheer unadulterated cruelty of it, the way he spat them out with such relish, finally, irrevocably shattered something deep within me. If you've ever been called worthless by someone who promised to love you, write, "Never again," in the comments. If you think I should have left him years ago, write, "Run." But remember, it's never that simple when you're living it. He wasn't finished. He grabbed my arm, his fingers digging into my flesh like talons, yanking me half out of my chair. "And you'll keep taking it, won't you?" he sneered, his face close to mine again. "Because where else would a useless old hag like you go?" He shoved me then. A hard, violent thrust that sent me sprawling sideways. My hip struck the corner of the coffee table with a sickening crack of pain, and I collapsed onto the floor, gasping. Tears of shock and agony stinging my eyes. He stood over me for a moment, his chest heaving, a look of savage satisfaction on his face. Then, as quickly as the storm had erupted, it seemed to pass. He grunted, turned, and stumbled toward the bedroom, likely to pass out, leaving me there on the floor. A crumpled heap of pain and despair. I lay there for a long time. The throbbing in my hip a counterpoint to the searing agony in my soul. The terror was a living thing coiling in my stomach, making it hard to breathe. This wasn't just verbal abuse anymore. Not just intimidation. He had put his hands on me with intent to hurt, to dominate. He had defined me as his punching bag, and a chilling certainty settled over me. If I stayed, that's all I would ever be. Until one day, one of his rages went too far. The thought of my grandchildren, of them ever witnessing such a scene, or worse, of them remembering me only as this broken, cowering woman, filled me with profound and sudden shame. No, Robert wouldn't have wanted this for me. I didn't want this for me. Slowly, painfully, I pulled myself up, using the coffee table for support. My hip screamed in protest, but a new different fire was beginning to burn through the fear. It was the fire of righteous anger, of a survival instinct I thought had long been extinguished. He called me worthless. He thought I was his property to abuse. He thought I had nowhere to go, no fight left in me. He was wrong. As I limped toward the bathroom to assess the blooming bruise on my hip, a plan, desperate and dangerous but absolutely necessary, began to form in my mind. I couldn't fight him physically. But I wasn't stupid. I wasn't entirely helpless. If I was going to escape this hell, if I was going to have any chance at a life free from his terror, I needed proof. Undeniable proof of the monster he became when the alcohol took hold. My word against his I knew would never be enough. Not after all these years of silence. I needed his own words, his own rages to condemn him. And I would get them. My life, I realized with chilling clarity, might very well depend on it. The days following Walter's punching bag assault were a haze of throbbing pain. Both in my hip where I'd struck the coffee table and in the deeper unseen places where his words had left their jagged wounds. The crack in the drywall where his fist had connected just inches from my head was a stark daily reminder of how close I'd come to something even worse. He'd been almost contrite the next morning, nursing a vicious hangover, muttering something about not meaning it and things getting out of hand. But there was no genuine apology, no flicker of remorse in his bloodshot eyes. Only the familiar scent of stale whiskey and the impatient demand for coffee and breakfast. The fear was a constant coiling serpent in my belly, but something else had taken root that night. A cold, hard resolve. I would not be his punching bag. Not literally, not figuratively. I would not let him erase me. But I was also a 68-year-old woman with a bad hip, living with a 70-year-old alcoholic whose rages were becoming increasingly physical. My word against his would be nothing. I needed proof. Cold, hard, undeniable proof. The idea of a diary came to me in the dead of night when Walter's snores rattled the thin walls of our small house. I retrieved an old cloth-bound ledger from the back of my closet, a relic from my brief stint as a secretary before Andrew was born. I found a pen that still worked, and with trembling hands I began to write. My first entry detailed the punching bag night. Every vile word, every menacing gesture, the crack in the wall, the throbbing bruise already purpling on my hip. Reliving it, even on paper, was agony. But as the words filled the page, a tiny spark of agency ignited within me. This was my truth. Recorded. Undeniable. I hid the ledger under a loose floorboard beneath my side of the bed, a place Walter, in his self-absorbed state, would never think to look. Each day thereafter, when he was out on one of his errands to Molly's or passed out in his armchair, I would retrieve it and meticulously document his latest outburst. October 17th. Walter home late, drunk. Accused me of hiding his wallet. He'd left it in the bathroom. Screamed for an hour. Threw his dinner plate across the kitchen. Chipped the linoleum. October 19th. Demanded I give him money for a sure bet. When I said there was none, he grabbed my arm, called me a lying old witch. Bruise forming. Taking photographs was riskier. My old smartphone wasn't the newest model, but its camera worked. When he was deeply asleep, his snores a guttural symphony, I'd creep out and snap pictures of the damage from his latest rampage. Another broken teacup. A chair overturned. The dent in the refrigerator where he'd slammed his fist. Once, when he grabbed my arm so tightly his fingerprints left angry red welts, I managed with shaking hands to take a photo in the dim light of the bathroom mirror. My own tear-filled eyes staring back at me. A stranger in my own reflection. Each click of the shutter felt like a small act of defiance. A piece of evidence stored against him. Share this story with someone who needs to know they're not alone. Drop a heart if you've ever had to document your own pain in secret. Your support means everything to women like me. All this time, I was acutely aware of Mrs. Peterson, my neighbor in the adjoining duplex. Martha Peterson was a widow herself, a few years older than me. A quiet, kind woman who mostly kept to herself but always had a gentle smile when we met at the mailbox or tending our tiny postage stamp gardens. Our living room walls were thin, a fact I'd always been self-conscious about, especially now. I knew she must hear Walter's tirades. His thundering voice. The occasional crash of something breaking. I'd see her sometimes, her face etched with concern as she quickly looked away when I caught her eye. I imagined her pity, her disapproval, and shame would burn through me, making me hurry back inside, desperate to hide the ugly truth of my marriage. I never spoke of it to her, of course. Who would want to admit their life had become such a horrifying hidden war zone? Walter's behavior didn't improve. If anything, the frequency of his rages increased as the money for his addiction dwindled further. He seemed to sense a shift in me, a new quiet watchfulness that he couldn't quite understand but that clearly irritated him. My feigned submissiveness, my careful placating words were a constant performance. Exhausting but necessary. He'd sometimes stare at me with narrowed, suspicious eyes as if trying to penetrate the fragile shell of my composure. "What are you looking so damn shifty about, old woman?" he'd grumble before launching into another round of complaints or demands. But with each new entry in my hidden journal, with each photograph stored on my phone, that tiny spark of agency within me grew a little stronger. I was no longer just enduring. I was documenting. I was building a case, brick by painful brick. The fear was still there, a constant companion. But it was now mixed with a sliver of something else. A desperate, fragile hope that one day this chronicle of cruelty might be my path to freedom. I didn't know how yet or when. But I clung to that hope into the growing weight of evidence hidden beneath my floorboards. Mrs. Peterson's concerned glances from over the fence, once a source of my shame, now began to feel like silent, unwitting allyship. A reminder that perhaps I wasn't entirely alone in hearing the echoes of Walter's tyranny. The chronicle of cruelty, as I'd morbidly nicknamed my hidden journal, grew heavier with each passing week. Walter's rages, fueled by an ever-increasing intake of cheap whiskey and his own festering resentments, were becoming more frequent, more unpredictable. The house felt like a minefield. I never knew what innocuous comment or action might set him off. My collection of blurry photographs expanded too. Another lampshade dented from being thrown. A cracked mirror from a slammed door too close to it. A new constellation of bruises on my arm from where he'd grabbed me to stop me flouncing off when he was talking. Or rather, screaming. The incident that finally broke through the thin veneer of our neighborhood's polite silence happened on a Tuesday night. Walter had come home later than usual, stumbling drunk, reeking of mollies and something else. Something acrid and unfamiliar. He was in a particularly foul mood, muttering about being cheated at cards. His eyes already glittering with dangerous light. He started an argument over nothing. The television being too loud, he claimed, though it was barely a whisper. His voice escalated quickly, his accusations becoming wild, paranoid. He said I was in cahoots with the men at the bar, that I'd somehow signaled them to cheat him. It was utter madness. Then he started smashing things. Not just the plate this time, but the small, delicate porcelain figurines my own mother had left me, lined up on the mantelpiece. He swept them to the floor with a roar, their shattering a series of tiny, heartbreaking explosions. "Useless old junk," he screamed. "Just like you." He advanced on me, his fists clenched, and I truly thought my time had come. I cowered, screaming his name, begging him to stop. The terror raw primal. He didn't hit me then, but he grabbed the mantelpiece clock, a wedding gift from his own parents, and hurled it against the wall where it exploded into 100 pieces. Then, as suddenly as it began, his rage seemed to dissipate, leaving him panting, swaying. He collapsed onto the sofa and within minutes was snoring heavily. I spent the rest of that night huddled in my armchair, too terrified to move, too heartbroken to cry anymore. The sounds of his destruction, my own pleas and screams, must have been horrifyingly clear through our paper-thin walls. The next morning, Walter was a sullen, groaning wreck, oblivious or indifferent to the devastation he'd caused. He mumbled something about needing to clear his head and lurched out of the house, presumably in search of his next drink. I was sweeping up the last of the porcelain shards, my hands trembling, when I saw Mrs. Peterson. My neighbor Martha stepped out onto her small porch. She was tending her window boxes, but her movements were hesitant, her gaze fixed on my front door with an expression of profound worry. I'd always kept a polite distance from Martha, a habit born of shame and a desperate need to hide the ugliness of my life. But today, something in her gentle concerned face made my carefully constructed walls begin to crumble. When Walter was safely out of sight, I took a deep breath and stepped onto my own porch, pretending to inspect a wilting petunia. Martha looked up, her kind wrinkled face etched with sadness that mirrored my own. "Rose, dear," she began, her voice low and hesitant. Are you all right?" I heard, well, it sounded like quite a commotion last night. My first instinct was to lie, to plaster on a brave smile and say everything was fine, just a clumsy accident. But the memory of Walter's contorted face, the sound of my mother's precious figurine shattering, the sheer terror of it all overwhelmed me. Tears welled in my eyes, hot and unstoppable. "Oh, Martha," I choked out, the words a dam bursting. "It's Walter. He gets so angry." She put down her watering can and, to my surprise, walked purposefully across the small patch of grass that separated our homes. She didn't stop at the fence. She came right up onto my porch, her presence a sudden, unexpected comfort. "Rose," she said, her voice filled with deep, unwavering empathy that I hadn't experienced from another human being in years. "I've been hearing things for a long time. More and more lately. Is shouting, things breaking, you crying?" She reached out and gently took my trembling hand. "You don't have to pretend with me, dear. No one should have to live like that. No one deserves to be treated that way. I've been so worried for you." Her words, so simple, so direct, so full of genuine compassion, undid me. The shame, the isolation, the years of pretending, it all came pouring out. I told her about the punching bag night, about the constant verbal abuse, the financial drain, the smashing of my treasured possessions, the ever-present fear. I even, my voice dropping to a near whisper, confessed to keeping a hidden journal and taking photographs. My desperate secret acts of defiance. Martha listened patiently, her expression growing more pained with each revelation, but also more resolute. She didn't interrupt, didn't offer easy platitudes. She just listened. And in her listening, I felt seen. Truly seen for the first time in what felt like an eternity. When I finally finished, exhausted and raw, she squeezed my hand. "Rose," she said, her voice firm but kind. "You are a strong woman to have endured this for so long. But you don't have to endure it anymore. That journal, those photographs, that's evidence. That's your truth. And if you ever decide you need someone to stand with you, to speak to what they've heard, I will. I will tell anyone who needs to know what it's like living next door to that man's rages. What I've heard of your fear." Her offer, so unexpected, so brave, was like a lifeline thrown to a drowning woman. A witness. Someone who believed me, who had independently corroborated a part of my hidden hell. The thought of not being entirely alone in this, of having someone who could speak to the pattern of Walter's terror, filled me with a surge of courage I hadn't known I possessed. "Oh, Martha," I said, fresh tears streaming down my face. But these were tears of gratitude, of dawning fragile hope. "You would do that for me?" Without a second thought, "Rose," she said, her gaze steady. "No woman should live in fear. If you have a neighbor like Martha, cherish them. If you are a neighbor like Martha, know that your kindness can save lives. Right, neighbor, if you've ever been helped by someone who barely knew you. Subscribe and share this story with someone who might need to hear it." That afternoon, after Martha had gone back to her own quiet home, leaving me with a renewed sense of purpose, I retrieved my hidden journal. I wrote about Walter's latest rampage, about the broken figurines, the shattered clock. And then I wrote about Martha. About her kindness, her courage, her offer of help. For the first time, the words I wrote didn't just feel like a record of despair, but like building blocks for a future. A future where I might actually be free. The path ahead was still terrifying, but now I didn't feel quite so alone on it. My small secret acts of recording the truth had found an echo in the heart of a brave neighbor. And together, our truths might just be strong enough to set me free. Martha Peterson's quiet offer to stand by me, to testify to the hell she'd overheard, was the flicker of candlelight I desperately needed in the suffocating darkness of my life with Walter. It didn't banish the fear entirely. Living with Walter was like living with a perpetually armed landmine. But it gave my resolve solid footing. I continued to document. My entries in the hidden ledger becoming more detailed. My collection of photographs of smashed crockery and once, a chillingly clear picture of Walter's fist-shaped dent in the pantry door, growing. Each piece of evidence was a small shield. A whispered promise to myself that I would not be his worthless old punching bag forever. The final frightening incident that propelled me out of that house wasn't a physical assault on me. Not directly. But something that chilled me even more with its cold, calculated cruelty and the glimpse it gave me into Walter's unraveling mind. He'd been on a multi-day bender, even worse than usual. I'd hidden myself away in the spare room, barricading the door with a chair, subsisting on crackers and water I'd stashed. On the third morning, he seemed to have drunk himself into a stupor. I ventured out cautiously to make a cup of tea. The living room was a wreck. Overturned furniture, broken glass, and in the middle of it all, Walter sat slumped in his armchair. Not passed out, but staring with a strange, almost beatific smile at my small terrified tabby cat, Mittens, whom he'd cornered. He was holding his nearly empty whiskey bottle by the neck like a club, muttering to her. "You see everything, don't you, you little spy?" he slurred, his voice dangerously soft. "You see what she's like? Maybe if you weren't here to comfort the old hag, she'd appreciate me more. Maybe you need to disappear." He raised the bottle slightly. My blood turned to ice. Mittens was my only constant gentle companion in that house. A small warm presence in my lonely life. The thought of him harming her out of some twisted drunken logic, it was unthinkable. That wasn't just anger or frustration anymore. That was a different kind of darkness. A cruelty that targeted the last innocent thing in my life. I didn't scream. I didn't move. I just backed away slowly, my heart pounding. When I was sure he hadn't seen me, I slipped out the back door, my purse with my phone and the key to my hidden journal clutched in my hand, and ran as fast as my 68-year-old legs could carry me across the small lawn to Martha Peterson's back door. She took one look at my white, terrified face and pulled me inside without a word. He's going to hurt Mittens," I gasped out. "He's lost his mind, Martha." Martha was a woman of action. While I sobbed incoherently, she made a quick call to animal control. Her voice calm but firm, reporting a potential animal cruelty situation and giving her address, but stressing the owner, Walter, was volatile and likely intoxicated. Then she turned to me. "Rose," she said, her hand on my shoulder. "You cannot go back in there. Not now. Not ever like this. You have your journal, your photos." I nodded numbly. "Good. We're going to call Susan Albright, my niece. She's a paralegal at a firm that does a lot of work with the Women's Advocacy Center downtown. It's time, dear. It's past time." The next few hours were a blur. Martha made me tea, found a safe temporary place for Mittens through a friend at the local shelter once animal control had discreetly checked and ensured Walter was now passed out. Then she drove me to a small unassuming office building downtown. Susan Albright was a young woman with kind eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. I felt a wave of shame as I sat before her. An old woman airing the dirty laundry of her failed marriage, her abusive husband. But Martha sat beside me, a steady presence, and Susan listened with quiet empathy that slowly chipped away at my fear. I laid out my story, my voice trembling at first, then gaining strength as I recounted Walter's escalating alcoholism, his verbal tirades, the financial ruin, the physical intimidation, the smashed possessions. And finally the punching bag incident and his terrifying threat toward Mittens. I showed Susan the photographs, read her excerpts from my journal. Martha quietly corroborated the timeline of the rages she had overheard, the sounds of fear and destruction. Susan listened intently, occasionally making notes, her expression growing more serious. When I finished, she looked at me, not with pity but with deep validating respect. "Mrs. Johnston," she said, "what you've endured is horrific. And what you've documented is incredibly brave and very powerful. You have a strong case for an emergency protective order, and certainly for a divorce that secures your safety and your assets." She explained the legal process. The steps we would need to take. An emergency order to get Walter out of the house, or to ensure I could return safely to gather my things while he was barred. Then the divorce proceedings, where my journal, the photos, and Mrs. Peterson's testimony would be crucial in arguing for a settlement that reflected his abuse and financial misconduct. Specifically aiming for the house and a significant portion of his pension. The thought of facing Walter in court, of him knowing I had done this, was still terrifying. But sitting there with Martha's quiet support and Susan's professional confidence, I felt a new kind of strength. The strength of someone who has finally chosen to fight for her own life. "Yes," I said, my voice clear and firm. "Let's do it. File whatever you need to. I want him out of my life and I want what's rightfully mine. To live out my remaining years in peace and safety." Susan smiled, a genuine encouraging smile. "Good," she said. "We'll start immediately." As we left the office, Martha squeezed my arm. "You did the right thing, Rose. The very brave right thing." I was still scared, but for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, I also felt a fragile tentative shoot of hope. The weight of my truth, corroborated and now in capable legal hands, Felt like it might actually be enough to break the chains Walter had bound me with for so long. Comment, justice if you believe abusers should face consequences. Right, freedom if you think every woman deserves to live without fear. Your words give strength to women still trapped in their own nightmares. The weeks leading up to the court date were a blur of anxious preparation and fragile hope. Thanks to the Women's Advocacy Center, I was staying in a small, clean but anonymous temporary apartment across town. A place Walter couldn't easily find, especially with the emergency protective order in place. Mrs. Peterson, my dear Martha, was my lifeline. She'd visit with groceries and updates from Elm Street. Walter, she reported, was initially belligerent about being served the papers, then sank into a sullen, bewildered state, mostly confined to the house now that his access to easy cash from me was gone. My lawyer, Miss Evans, a sharp, compassionate woman provided through legal aid, meticulously prepared our case. My hidden journal with its tear-stained pages and stark entries became Exhibit A. The photographs of smashed crockery, the dented wall, the ugly bruise on my arm from when Walter had last grabbed me, they were all carefully catalogued. Martha, bless her steadfast heart, prepared her statement about the years of overheard rages and my palpable fear. The day we finally walked into that courtroom, my stomach was a knot of icy dread. Walter was already there, slumped beside his court-appointed lawyer, looking disheveled and older than his 70 years. His eyes, when they briefly met mine, were filled not with remorse but with a familiar resentful glare. He still didn't get it. He still thought he was the victim. The courtroom itself was an impersonal, intimidating space. But Miss Evans' calm presence beside me was a comfort. When it was my turn to speak, to detail the 40 years of my marriage and Walter's descent into alcoholic abuse, my voice trembled at first. But as I looked at the judge, a woman with kind but discerning eyes, and recounted the punching bag night, the terror, the constant fear, a strange strength flowed through me. I was no longer Rose, Walter's cowering wife. I was Rose Johnston, a survivor speaking her truth. Miss Evans then presented my journal, reading key dated entries aloud. Chronicles of his verbal assaults, his threats, the sounds of his violence. She showed the photographs of the damage to our home, the bruises on my skin. Walter's lawyer tried to object, calling it exaggerated, taken out of context, the ramblings of an unhappy woman. Then Martha Peterson took the stand. In her calm, clear voice, she described living next door to us for over 20 years. She spoke of the escalating frequency and intensity of Walter's shouting, the sounds of things breaking, my occasional stifled cries. She wasn't dramatic. She was factual. Her testimony painting a chilling picture of the reign of terror I had endured. A terror that had seeped through the very walls of our homes. Walter glowered at her, but Martha met his gaze steadily, unafraid. When it was Walter's turn, he tried to play the part of the misunderstood, henpecked husband, complaining about my nagging and unreasonable expectations. He denied any significant abuse, claiming he was just a man who enjoyed a drink now and then and had a bit of a temper when provoked. His lawyer argued that I was trying to unfairly secure all their marital assets. But then Miss Evans, during her cross-examination, presented him with specific dated entries from my journal detailing his rages, asking him if he denied those specific incidents, those specific vile words. She showed him the photos of the smashed heirlooms, the dented wall. Faced with this meticulous record, his bluster began to crumble. He became evasive, contradictory, his earlier facade of wronged innocence shattering under the weight of documented truth. The judge listened to everything with grave, unwavering attention. When all the testimony was done, she took a long moment, her gaze sweeping from Walter's now deflated form to me. "Mr. Johnston," she said finally, her voice devoid of any sympathy for him. "The evidence presented today paints a clear and disturbing picture of long-term, escalating domestic abuse, significantly fueled by your untreated alcoholism. Your wife, Mrs. Johnston, has endured what no person should have to endure in a marriage or in any relationship." My heart pounded. This was it. Therefore, the judge continued, this court grants the divorce. A permanent restraining order is hereby issued preventing Mr. Johnston from approaching within 500 yards of Mrs. Johnston or her residence. Regarding the division of marital assets, she paused, looking directly at Walter. Given the documented history of abuse, Mr. Johnston's financial recklessness due to his addiction, and Mrs. Johnston's clear need for future security and peace, this court awards Mrs. Rose Johnston sole ownership of the marital home on Elm Street. A gasp escaped me. The house. My home. It would be mine. Truly mine. A sanctuary. The judge wasn't finished. Furthermore, considering the dissipation of marital funds by Mr. Johnston for his addiction and to ensure Mrs. Johnston's support, A significant portion of Mr. Johnston's pension shall be awarded to Mrs. Johnston. The exact amount to be determined based on state guidelines but reflective of the circumstances presented. She then sternly mandated Walter to attend and complete a state-certified alcohol treatment program and a domestic violence intervention program. Walter just stared, his face ashen, his jaw slack. Defeated. The fight, the bluster, all of it gone. Replaced by a dawning horrified understanding of the consequences of his actions. Walking out of that courthouse, leaning on Martha's arm, I felt a wave of exhaustion so profound I could barely stand. But beneath it, a new quiet emotion was stirring. Relief. A profound life-altering relief. The legal battle was over. The constant fear that had been my shadow for decades was finally beginning to lift. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. There were scars, emotional and psychological, that would take a long time to heal. But as I stepped out into the bright afternoon sun, I knew I was free. My home would be a place of peace again. My finances would be secure. Walter, the abusive alcoholic thug who had called me his punching bag, would no longer have the power to hurt me. My diary, the photos of his smashed walls and my bruised skin, and the quiet courage of a brave neighbor, my truth had won me my justice. And that, I realized, was the only beginning I needed. If this story touched you, please subscribe. Share it with someone who might be suffering in silence. Leave a comment telling me where you're listening from, what time it is, and whether you think I deserved my freedom. Write, Rose, if you believe every woman has the right to reclaim her life. Remember, you're never too old to start over. You're never too broken to heal. And you're never ever alone. Thank you for listening to my story. It wasn't easy to tell, but if it helps even one person find their courage, then every painful memory was worth sharing.